So the next step is to actually add the scroll view. So I'm going to add it to this panel that we created. I'm going to right click on the panel and choose UI Scroll View. Now this, some of you may have seen our previous training about creating runtime scroll lists, and this is where things have changed a little bit since about a year and a half ago when we did that. The scroll view is now an element in the UI menu here, and it will create a scroll view. So previously you had to create a panel and then add a Scroll Rect component and set everything up by hand. Now, if we just create a scroll view, we'll see that it comes with a viewport, which has a content child game object. And it also has a horizontal and vertical scroll bar automatically created. So a number of steps that you previously would have had to do manually have now been sort of packaged up into this pre-made set of game objects, which is pretty handy. And this is one of the reasons we wanted to update this training. So now we have the scroll view, which has the main component here, which is the Scroll Rect component. And the Scroll Rect component governs the behavior of our scroll list. So we have the movement type, whether we can scroll horizontally and or vertically. Here we have a choice about the behavior of the scroll bars. And this is kind of interesting. So the default behavior, which is the behavior we're going to use, is to auto hide and expand them. So here we have a viewport, right? And let's push F to frame selected on this. We can see the shape of the viewport. Now, the content, we can see the rect of the content is actually bigger than the viewport. What this will mean is that it will automatically, or it's bigger along the vertical axis. So this will automatically cause our vertical scroll bar to be enabled and displayed so that we can view, even if it's empty, we can view this full content rect. So let's just take a look at that quickly. We'll play our scene. And now we can see, there's nothing in there, right? But we can see that the scroll bar for the horizontal axis is disabled because there's no additional content that needs to be displayed. But because we have that larger content rect, the vertical scroll bar is enabled by default. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the entire scroll view, and in the rect transform, we are going to stretch it to fit the Scroll Shop A panel. So just click on that, and then I am going to drag down the rect so that it begins at the top of where the header image ends. Okay, now our viewport and our content is now actually much smaller than the viewport, right? So what we're going to do is we're actually going to, let's take a look at how this is sort of set up with the viewport and the content. So I'm going to add a piece of content as a child. So I'm going to right click on content with it selected, go to UI, image, which is going to create an image. And I am going to select an image here, and we will choose a sprite. And the sprite we're going to use is this sky sprite. And I'm going to take that sprite and stretch it to fit the rect of the content. And I'm going to take the content and make it much bigger, right? Let's make it bigger both on the vertical and the horizontal axis, right? And our image is stretching to fit that content rect, the parent. So now, if we play, we'll see that both our vertical and our horizontal scrolling are enabled, right? Because we have a larger piece of content than the viewport. Now, the way that this is set up is that we have a mask component attached to the viewport and an image component. So the mask component is what causes this to behave like a window. If we turn this off, we can see that we can still, and we can also click just on the content and drag it around, as well as using the scroll bars. So we can see, right, that it is no longer masked it just displays as this big floating image. And so it's the mask component that sort of crops it to fit in the viewport rect. If we want to use a custom mask, we can just by changing the source image in the image component, which is attached to the same game object. So we could choose, there's, for example, this knob, sort of low resolution circle, but we can see that this is going to create this sort of circular vignette mask shape. So if you want, and the reason this is jaggy is just because it's a tiny low-res knob image. But you can make your own custom masks if you want to have cool shaped windows, and do that by replacing the source image here. We're just going to go back to this default UI mask image, and we can actually delete this. Well, actually, before we do that, let's take a look at the other settings in the Scroll Rect. So right now, the behavior that we have, the movement type we have is elastic, right? And so we can see we can actually go past the bounds of our content, and then it will bounce back. And I'm just clicking, and we can kind of flick it and toss it. So this is kind of similar to maybe the behavior that you would see on iOS, where there's some inertia and some bounciness. And so this is this elastic movement type in the Scroll Rect, and we can control the elasticity, whether there's inertia, the properties for that. We also have an unrestricted option. What this means is that we can actually just go outside of the area of the content. It's pretty easy to lose your content doing that, but you may find a case where that makes sense or you need to do that. The last is sort of the simplest. It's the clamped mode, and in this case, we can go to the edges of our content, but we can't overshoot. We're going to stick with the elastic default mode because that works pretty well for our example. Okay, so let me just take a quick look at the chat, and before we move on to starting to add some buttons to this scroll list.